Why did Donald Trump impose tariffs even on his closest allies? Why wasn't he worried when the stock market took a dive? And could all the economic chaos we're witnessing, from trade tensions to the wave of supply chain withdrawals, actually be part of a well-calculated plan? Many people believe that Trump's actions are impulsive and emotionally driven. But what if that's just the surface of a strategy quietly reshaping the entire global economic order? An order where the U.S. not only reclaims its central role, but rewrites the rules in an unprecedented way. In this video, we'll dive deep into a question that might sound outrageous, but deserves serious consideration. Are Trump's tariffs actually rational? According to Scott Bessent, who's expected to be the next Treasury Secretary under Trump, tariffs are not just temporary economic tools. They're the starting point of a comprehensive reconstruction plan to reshape the global economic order in favor of the United States. Once again, America is trying to rewrite the rules of the game. In the 20th century, there were only two clear moments when the U.S. redefined the global trade system. First, in 1944 with the creation of the Bretton Woods system, marking the beginning of the dollar's dominance in Western-led international financial institutions. Second, in the early 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher pushed forward the neoliberal order, paving the way for modern globalization. Now, with Trump returning to office in 2025, the U.S. appears to be entering a third phase, an entirely new order built around the principle of America First. At the core of this new order is a classification of countries into three groups, as Bessent puts it, green, yellow, and red. Each group represents a different level of priority and access to U.S. resources, from tariffs and military protection to access to the dollar. The green group includes nations favored and close to Washington, while the red group faces maximum restrictions and must navigate a fragmented world on their own. This is not just about tariffs. It's a tool to sort friends from foes and restructure alliances and supply chains based on the Trump administration's vision. Scott Bessent is no ordinary figure. A seasoned speculator, he once rocked the UK financial market alongside George Soros in the early 1990s during the assault on the British pound. He's also taught economic history at GEO. Alongside him is Stephen Miron, a new but influential name in both finance and academia. A Harvard PhD and hedge fund strategist, Miron sparked major debate on Wall Street with his proposal to rebuild the global trading system. Both men shared deep concern about America's long-standing deindustrialization. To them, the loss of manufacturing is not just an economic problem, it's a geopolitical threat. In the 1950s, manufacturing made up 28% of America's value-added output. Today, that number has dropped to just 10%. Trump's first-term trade war failed to reverse that trend. But with a new advisory team, the current strategy isn't just about fixing trade deficits. It's about reviving the industrial base of the U.S., a crucial foundation if the country hopes to remain a global leader in the 21st century. Behind what may sound like emotional rhetoric, Trump's campaign reflects a deeper anxiety about a future where the U.S. could fall behind in strategic competition, especially against China. If a conflict breaks out, will the U.S. have enough production capacity to support a prolonged war? As Vice President J.D. Vance once pointed out, a Chinese state-owned company built more ships last year alone than the U.S. has produced since World War II. That reality has sounded serious alarm bells in Washington. Against this backdrop, Trump's push for reindustrialization becomes more understandable. But the method, attacking even America's closest allies, has left many feeling uneasy. Trump has not hesitated to call allies job thieves, wealth takers, and exploiters who've taken far too much from America over the years. In his view, the difference between friend and foe is increasingly blurred. Both are to blame for America's current imbalances. Still, one fact is undeniable. The U.S. remains the world's #1 superpower. The question now is whether this confrontational, even isolationist, approach will help America solidify that position in the long run, or trigger an unprecedented crisis in its global alliances. With interest rates soaring, making it harder to get a mortgage. With exchange rates and tariffs fluctuating. With imports becoming more expensive. With rising U.S.-China tensions. And with businesses cutting overseas orders. What used to be a game of global giants has now become deeply personal. the global order designed by the U.S. To understand why today's global trade system exists in its current form, and why the Trump administration seeks to overturn it, we need to look back at the broader history of modern economics, especially the two major global orders that the United States created and led. What we are seeing today, tariff policies and the categorization of countries into green, yellow, and red groups, is not random. It is a systematic response to a decades-long trend, the deindustrialization of the U.S. economy. The first global order initiated by the U.S. was the Bretton Woods system, formed at the end of World War II and lasting until 1973. Economically, its rules were established in 1944 at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. At the same time, bilateral and multilateral security agreements, including the creation of NATO and the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, formed a comprehensive framework known collectively as the Bretton Woods Economic and Security Order. Participation in this system meant countries agreed to peg their currencies to the U.S. dollar, while the dollar itself was backed by gold. They also received military protection from the U.S., sometimes including American military bases on their soil. To help rebuild war-torn economies, the U.S. opened its domestic market to goods from allied nations, provided aid through the Marshall Plan, and allowed these countries to implement some protectionist policies to develop their industries, without competing directly with American businesses. From today's perspective, this may seem like an enormous giveaway to U.S. allies, but that's a misunderstanding. In reality, it was a two-way deal. The U.S. also gained significant strategic benefits. In a world undergoing reconstruction and political polarization, building strong economic alliances with developing nations was crucial for regional stability and promoting shared values. Thus, the Bretton Woods system was not merely an economic aid mechanism. It was a central part of U.S. national security and foreign policy strategy. Second, post-war American industries needed foreign markets, and wealthier allies meant more export opportunities. Promoting prosperity in Europe and Japan was not charity. It was a strategic investment that supported America's own economic growth. The third and perhaps most profound benefit was the role of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. Once the dollar became the standard for international transactions, the entire world needed to hold dollars to trade, giving the U.S. extraordinary privilege. As former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing once described, the U.S. could spend beyond its means without being punished by normal financial rules. Unlike other countries, it didn't need to balance its budget. It could issue debt in the very currency the rest of the world was forced to use. But in the shadow of these advantages, a quiet consequence began to form: deindustrialization. The Tariff Dilemma. As allies like Japan and Western European nations gained access to the U.S. market and developed their own manufacturing sectors, American industries gradually lost competitiveness. This was a trade-off Washington willingly accepted during the Cold War, prioritizing strategic interests over domestic jobs. But over time, the cost became increasingly clear. Stephen Miron described this effect as a dilemma in economic theory known as the Tariff paradox. To maintain the dollar's role as the global reserve currency, the U.S. had to continuously supply dollars to the world, primarily through persistent trade deficits. But those very deficits weakened domestic manufacturing, making the U.S. increasingly dependent on imports and services instead of industrial production. As the global economy expanded, so did the demand for U.S. dollars, the core currency of international trade. But unlike dollars, gold, the backbone of the financial system at the time, is finite. This created a fundamental contradiction. The U.S. either had to print more dollars to meet global demand, weakening trust in the gold standard, or it had to restrict the money supply to maintain stability, effectively choking the very global economy it led. Faced with this conflict, in 1971, President Richard Nixon made a landmark decision. In a nationally televised address, he announced a temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. Though presented as a short-term measure, this decision marked the official collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1973. The global economy entered a period of turmoil. floating currencies, rising inflation, and a new reality that countries had to adapt to. That chaos eventually led to the birth of a new order, the neoliberal world order, led by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the early 1980s. Where Bretton Woods was a tightly regulated system bound by agreements, neoliberalism was much looser and more flexible. Tariffs fell, investment barriers were removed, and exchange rates floated, creating a world where capital could move freely across borders. In this system, the U.S. played the role of guarantor. Guarantor of global security, of trade flow, and, most importantly, of the dollar's central role in the world economy. No country was forced to use the dollar. No binding treaties like Bretton Woods required it. Yet they did, because the dollar was the most stable and convenient currency for trade. To build up dollar reserves, countries ramped up exports to the U.S. and limited imports. Thus, an asymmetric model formed. America became the world's consumption hub, while the rest of the world competed to become its factory. A striking paradox in the neoliberal order was that multilateral institutions, especially the World Trade Organization, WTO, effectively allowed developing countries to impose higher tariffs on U.S. goods than the reverse. This reflected a core American belief at the time. By making the rest of the world richer, the U.S. would also become safer and more prosperous, just as it had with Germany and Japan after World War II. Compared to Bretton Woods, the neoliberal order was much more expansive. Any country that followed free market principles and joined the WTO could benefit from the system. Access to American consumers, a banking network built around the dollar, and even protection by the U.S. Navy along major shipping routes. But while many countries benefited, the biggest winner remained the United States. Benefits and drawbacks. With the U.S. dollar no longer tied to gold, the global demand for dollar-denominated assets, especially U.S. government bonds, soared. As Stephen Miron pointed out, this drove the value of the dollar far above what would be balanced in a purely trade-based system. It was a new form of privilege, even more powerful than under the Bretton Woods era. A strong dollar helped the U.S. maintain massive military spending and a global presence, even though its economy had shrunk relative to the 1950s. It also made Americans wealthier through cheap imports and low borrowing costs. But the downside was just as clear. A strong dollar made domestic production more expensive. Manufacturing jobs began to leave the U.S. for lower-cost countries. China's entry into the WTO in 2001 marked a major turning point, a shock known as the China Shock, which accelerated American deindustrialization. China not only profited under the neoliberal order, it became a manufacturing superpower, threatening key U.S. industries like automotive, electronics, and even defense. By 2016, frustration had spread across America. Job losses, growing inequality, and a sense of betrayal by the very global system the U.S. had created were becoming impossible to ignore. It was in this climate that Donald Trump was elected president, launching his first trade war against China. But despite the headlines, the war did little to reverse deindustrialization. China retaliated with countermeasures and, once the dust settled, continued to maintain higher tariffs on U.S. goods. Under President Joe Biden, U.S. policy shifted toward large-scale subsidies for domestic industry, a strategy China had long practiced. This sparked a wave of new factories across America. Yet according to Besant and Miron, this is just a short-term fix, one that creates massive budget deficits and can't last forever. So now, the U.S. stands at a crossroads. The neoliberal order it once created is unraveling. The dollar, once a symbol of strength and stability, is now seen as a burden to American manufacturing, and those who helped build the system are now dealing with its consequences. To Trump's team, things have gone too far. Deindustrialization is no longer just an economic issue, it's a national security threat. That's where the MAGA plan steps in, not just as a campaign slogan, but as a blueprint for a brand new global order. The MAGA plan. Trump's strategy to reshape the global economic order revolves around two seemingly contradictory goals: reindustrializing the United States and preserving the U.S. dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. To many economists, This is an unsolvable paradox. A strong dollar is essential for its reserve status, while reindustrialization requires a weaker dollar to boost export competitiveness. However, to figures like Stephen Miron, this dual objective is not only achievable, it's a necessary pursuit. So far, no comprehensive official plan has been announced. What exists are scattered arguments from articles, speeches, and public statements by Miron, Bessent, and others. But from these incomplete pieces, we can start to understand the three-stage strategy being rolled out in the broader MAGA plan. Step 1. Tariff chaos. This is the phase the world is witnessing right now. It's when the Trump administration signals it's ready to play hardball, regardless of financial market backlash or short-term recession fears. Tariffs are not only aimed at rivals like China, but also at longtime U.S. allies in Europe and Asia. According to Bessent, although tariffs were initially not seen as a bargaining tool, Trump effectively added a new leg to the stool, turning them into a core negotiation lever. Miron also mentioned that his proposed dollar strategy could only be enacted after sufficiently strong tariffs had been imposed. In essence, step 1 is to create the necessary disruption to rebalance negotiating power. Step 2. Reciprocal tariffs. Once the chaos reaches a tipping point, the plan moves to establish a system of reciprocal tariffs. The goal is no longer to escalate tensions, but to reshape the entire global trade playing field. If every party applies symmetrical tariffs, the incentive for trade freeloading fades, paving the way for fairer global competition. According to Bessent, tariffs at this stage are designed to reward ingenuity, security, rule of law, and stability, rather than encourage practices like currency manipulation, IP theft, or non-tariff barriers. Of course, many in academia strongly oppose this approach. They cite the 1930s economic crisis and the historical damage of protectionism to argue that trade wars lead to global recessions. But Miron counters with a more pragmatic point. The world needs US dollars. With no viable alternative, everyone will still try to export to the US in exchange for dollars. That gives the US a unique bargaining position. Trump's first trade war failed in part because China easily rerouted goods through countries like Vietnam or Mexico, and then re-exported them to the US. To close this loophole, the current administration is expanding tariffs globally. The new strategy isn't just about confrontation. It's meant to force trade partners into a deeper agreement. A comprehensive monetary framework to rebalance trade through exchange rate alignment and oversight mechanisms. Step 3. The Mar-a-Lago Agreement. Named after Trump's private resort, this deal is expected to become a historic milestone, akin to Bretton Woods, 1944, or the Plaza Accord, 1985, which once defined global monetary systems. Though Miron has grown more reserved since joining the administration, he has left clues. The final stage aims to weaken the dollar in a controlled manner while maintaining its role at the center of the global financial system. The Trump team's ideal scenario is a system where green nations, close allies, agree to peg their exchange rates to the US dollar. But unlike Bretton Woods, where the dollar was backed by gold, the new system will rest solely on political and economic commitments. If the dollar becomes too strong, green nations will adjust their currencies to maintain balance. In return, they gain access to the U.S. market, security privileges, and full integration into the dollar-based financial ecosystem. But unlike the generous post-World War II era, the U.S. today is no longer offering these benefits for free. Countries must now contribute, whether through defense spending, importing U.S. goods, or supporting U.S. geopolitical goals, as a condition for protection. This new alliance model, in effect, resembles a modern tributary system. Washington remains the center, not as a benevolent sponsor, but as a conditional enforcer. What began as chaotic tariff wars, it turns out, may be just the opening act of a long-term, organized, and ambitious strategy to reshape the global economic order. In this vision, the US dollar won't be replaced, but its role will be restructured. More flexible, less dependent on pure financial might, and more tightly linked to America's geopolitical leadership. From that foundation, the MAGA plan aspires not only to make America great again, but to rebuild the entire world around its central position. The final piece. Let's now turn to the unfinished piece in this larger picture, the actual feasibility of the MAGA plan. From Bessent's recent statements and the visible internal logic of the plan, it's clear that the world cannot be separated into discrete categories like economy, military, currency, or politics. In Trump's vision, all these elements are interconnected, forming a strategic network of power that can be rearranged to maximize U.S. national interest. That's why the current global economic chaos isn't the result of a poorly calculated policy, but rather the first phase of a larger strategy. It's a pressure tactic to create leverage for the next steps. At the center of this plan is the classification of countries into 3 groups: green, yellow, and red, each representing a strategic hierarchy. The green nations will enjoy major benefits in trade, access to the dollar, and military protection, as long as they peg their currencies to the dollar and adhere to new rules set by Washington. In theory, if enough countries agree to join the new MAGA system, this would allow the U.S. to have a weaker dollar while still retaining its reserve currency status, a balance previously considered impossible. But theory and reality are 2 different worlds. The success of this plan depends on one critical condition: other nations must trust and be willing to join a U.S.-led system. And this is where the plan's biggest weakness begins to show: to persuade a nation to peg its currency to the dollar, giving up some economic sovereignty in exchange for military protection and access to the U.S. market, requires an intangible asset that America increasingly lacks: trust. Back in 1944, during the creation of the Bretton Woods system, the world trusted the U.S. as a victorious power and a reliable guarantor of post-war order. A similar level of trust existed in the 1985 Plaza Accord, when Washington was able to coordinate major economies like Japan and Western Europe to realign currencies for mutual benefit. But today, after a series of controversial moves, pulling out of trade agreements, threatening close allies, and even suggesting intervention in European territories, a big question arises. How many nations still trust Trump's America enough to join a new U.S.-led system? If nations decline the invitation to join the green group, if they are unwilling to trade currency sovereignty for market access and security, then the whole system won't function as envisioned. At that point, the U.S. will face a tough choice. Either abandon its role as issuer of the world's reserve currency, resulting in a loss of global power and influence, or continue to maintain the dollar's dominance and remain dependent on supply chains from partners like Mexico, Europe, or Japan, something Trump wants to escape at all costs. Even Trump's well-educated advisory team must confront the harsh realities of geopolitics. A new system can't be built on economic models or exchange rate charts alone. It must be bound by strategic trust and long-term commitments, something hard to ensure from a government known for walking away from previous deals. Still, despite all the doubts, the MAGA plan continues to draw attention for its scale and boldness. We can't deny the appeal of the vision laid out by Bessent and Miron: a world where America regains its manufacturing edge while continuing to lead global finance through a more flexible, strategically managed dollar. Yet for now, all of this remains hypothetical, outlined in scattered statements and essays, not in an official policy manual. Ultimately, this video is not about supporting or opposing a specific plan. It's about recognizing that the world is undergoing a deep restructuring, where once unchallenged assumptions like the role of the dollar or global supply chains are now open to renegotiation under a new emerging paradigm, still unclear in shape. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it helpful and want to hear more, leave us a comment and suggest topics you'd like us to explore. We'll consider and try to produce the most feasible ideas. Until next time, goodbye and see you in the next video.